1. Willa Blanc. Willa Blanc was 50 years old when her name made headlines not for her work as a cleaner, but for a crime that would leave an entire community stunned. Once known to neighbors as a woman with a warm smile and fashionable style, she drove a red Corvette and wore designer glasses, projecting an image of success. Yet behind that image, Blanc's life was far from glamorous, struggling financially, facing foreclosure on her home, and frequenting casinos. She found herself consumed by debt and desperate for a way out. Born in 1961, Blanc's early life remains largely private, but accounts from family members describe her as loving and, at times, fiercely proud. She raised a son, Louis Wilkinson, and worked humble jobs to support herself. By 2008, she crossed paths with Walter Sartori, a 73-year-old retired scientist living a secluded life in Kentucky. Sartori, brilliant but reclusive, struggled with paranoid schizophrenia and severe social phobia, though he had amassed a multi-million-dollar fortune through investments. He lived quietly and cautiously, trusting few people. That very isolation made him vulnerable, and tragically, it placed him in Blanc's path. Investigators believe Blanc first encountered Sartori while cleaning a neighbor's home. Over time, she insinuated herself into his life, visiting often and building a fragile trust. But in February 2009, Sartori confided to online friends that he suspected Blanc of trying to scam him. He even changed his locks, a final attempt to create distance. It wasn't enough. Days later, Sartori vanished. Authorities later pieced together a chilling timeline. Sartori was kidnapped and taken to Blanc's basement, where he was restrained. He died within a week, whether from illness, neglect, or stress remains debated, but the aftermath was undeniable. Blanc forged documents to gain control of his accounts, draining over $200,000 and attempting to seize millions more. With her son's help, she transported Sartori's body across state lines, burned it in a remote Indiana forest, and scattered the remains, hoping no one would ever find them. But Sartori wasn't as alone as Blanc believed. A close-knit group of online friends noticed his sudden silence and alerted police. Their persistence triggered a multi-agency investigation that uncovered the forged paperwork, the financial theft, and ultimately, Sartori's remains. In March 2009, Blanc and her son were arrested in Ohio. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Blanc pleaded guilty to kidnapping, theft, and abuse of a corpse to avoid the death penalty. In 2012, she was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Even in court, she showed no outward remorse, a fact that prosecutors and Sartori's friends found haunting. When asked why she did it, investigators could only point to one motive: greed. Walter Sartori, a man whose greatest fear was betrayal, was betrayed in the worst way imaginable. His story raises a chilling question: how well can we ever truly know the people we let into our lives? 2. Amy Bosley. Amy Bosley was 38 years old when her name shifted from admired community figure to convicted murderer. In Campbell County, Kentucky, she and her husband, Robert Bosley, were viewed as local success stories. Together, they built a $1 million roofing business, raised 2 young children, and appeared to live the American dream, volunteering at charity events and enjoying the privileges their hard work afforded. Their weekend retreat, a luxury cabin nestled deep in the woods, symbolized everything they had achieved. But beneath that polished image, the Bosley marriage carried fractures hidden from public view, fractures that would ultimately turn deadly. Amy's life before the crime seemed enviable. Friends described her as attractive, kind, and devoted to her family. But behind closed doors, the couple's relationship was strained. Rumors swirled about Robert's long absences on Lake Cumberland, where he reportedly partied with other women, while Amy, responsible for the family's finances, quietly struggled to manage their business's mounting tax debts. The facade of perfection was crumbling, and Amy was desperate to keep Robert from discovering just how bad things had become. The tipping point came in May 2005. Investigators later discovered that Amy had embezzled nearly $2 million in unpaid taxes from the business, hiding overdue IRS notices, and even impersonating her husband over the phone to keep the truth from him. Friends would later recall ominous remarks Amy had made that if Robert ever left her, she would shoot him. Whether those words were a threat or a warning, no one imagined she would act on them. On the morning of May 17th, 2005, Amy made a frantic 911 call. Through sobs, she claimed an intruder had broken into their cabin, shot Robert, and fled into the woods. When police arrived, they found the back door shattered, rooms ransacked, and Robert Bosley dead from multiple gunshot wounds. Their 2 young sons, asleep in a loft upstairs, were unharmed but terrified. At first, the scene appeared to support Amy's story, but detectives soon noticed inconsistencies. Nothing was stolen. The glass from the door, supposedly shattered during the break-in, lay on top of undisturbed items suggesting it had been staged after the shooting. And when the children were interviewed, they revealed a chilling detail. They had heard gunshots before the sound of breaking glass, directly contradicting their mother's account. As investigators dug deeper, a motive emerged. Financial records exposed Amy's secret theft, the looming IRS audit, and the risk of Robert discovering everything. 10 days after the murder, Amy Bosley was arrested. Confronted with the possibility of her children testifying against her, she accepted a plea deal. In 2006, she admitted to the killing and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. For Robert's family, the plea brought no comfort. They believed greed and fear had driven Amy's actions, and that the children, orphaned in a single night, carried the deepest scars. As one relative said in court, "We hope every night you see his face and the faces of your children." 3. Virginia Caudill. Virginia Susan Caudill was 39 years old when she became the first woman sentenced to death in Kentucky in decades. Once an ordinary figure in Lexington's working-class community, she had lived a life marked by instability, a turbulent relationship with her boyfriend, struggles with addiction, and financial hardship that often pushed her into desperate decisions. Those closest to her described a woman who could be warm and engaging one moment and unpredictable the next. But by 1998, Virginia's life had unraveled to the point where survival and her growing dependence on crack cocaine drove every choice she made. Caudill's personal turmoil escalated after a falling out with her boyfriend, Steve White. Their breakup left her without stability, and in the days that followed, she found herself staying in so-called crack houses, drifting between acquaintances. It was during this chaotic period that she reconnected with Jonathan Goforth, an old acquaintance. Both shared a need for quick cash, and together they devised a plan, one that would bring them to the home of Steve White's 73-year-old mother, Lynetta White. In the early hours of March 15th, 1998, the pair approached Lynetta's house under the pretense of needing help. Accounts of what happened next diverge, with each blaming the other. But what is undisputed is this: the visit turned violent. Lynetta White, a woman known for her kindness and devotion to family, was attacked inside her own home. After the assault, her house was ransacked. Jewelry, firearms, and even a mink coat were stolen. The pair then placed Lynetta's body in the trunk of her own car, drove it to a rural field in Fayette County, and set it ablaze a desperate attempt to erase what they had done. The investigation quickly zeroed in on Caudill due to her prior relationship with the victim's son. Questioned that very evening, she denied involvement, casting suspicion on Goforth instead, but as the evidence mounted, stolen property traced back to her, jailhouse informants recounting her admissions, and her own conflicting statements, the net closed in. Months later, Caudill was arrested in New Orleans after fleeing across multiple states. Goforth was captured soon after. Their trial revealed not only the brutality of the crime, but the motive behind it. A frantic search for money to feed an addiction. The jury convicted both Caudill and Goforth of murder, robbery, burglary, arson, and evidence tampering. In March 2000, Virginia Caudill was sentenced to death, making her the only woman on Kentucky's death row, a status she still holds today. Experts have described her actions as a mix of desperation and opportunism, rather than premeditated malice. Yet, for Lynetta White's family, such distinctions offer little comfort. As one prosecutor later observed, this was about greed, about drugs, and about a woman willing to destroy lives for both. Even now, decades later, the case lingers as a haunting question. How far will desperation drive someone who feels they have nothing left to lose? 4. Kathy Coy. Kathy Michelle Coy was 33 years old when she carried out one of Kentucky's most disturbing crimes. Twice divorced and raising 2 teenagers, Coy's life appeared chaotic but unremarkable to those around her. Neighbors in Morgantown described her as quiet, friendly, even helpful, but beneath this facade, Coy harbored a fixation she had been claiming, falsely, that she was pregnant. To family, friends, and even her estranged husband, she maintained the elaborate ruse, complete with stolen ultrasound photos and fabricated due dates. That lie would spiral into violence. The months leading up to the crime reveal a troubling pattern. Coy had suffered what she claimed was a miscarriage, but rather than disclose the loss, she doubled down on the illusion. Experts later suggested she may have been driven by a desperate need for connection, a belief that a baby would secure love, stability, or social validation. As the due date she invented drew closer, Coy's obsession intensified. She began stalking expectant mothers on social media, looking for someone vulnerable enough to trust her. That search led her to Jamie Stice, a 21-year-old from Bowling Green, Kentucky. Jamie was excited about motherhood, often sharing photos of her growing baby bump online. In early 2011, Coy befriended her on Facebook, offering support and promising baby supplies. Their friendship seemed harmless at first, but on April 13th, Coy lured Jamie into her car under the pretense of shopping for baby items. What happened next shocked even seasoned investigators. Coy subdued Jamie using a stun gun, then carried out a calculated plan to claim the baby as her own. Hours later, Coy appeared at a friend's house holding a newborn boy, still attached to biological material that betrayed her story. She insisted she had just given birth in the car. The friend, alarmed, called for an ambulance. When hospital staff examined Coy, they quickly determined she had not delivered a baby and contacted police. As investigators unraveled the case, Coy's lies collapsed. A search of her home and computer revealed connections to multiple pregnant women she had targeted online. Under questioning, she led detectives to a wooded area where Jamie Stice's body was found. The infant, miraculously, survived and was later named Isaiah. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Coy entered a plea of guilty but mentally ill, sparing her the death penalty. In 2012, she was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. For Jamie's family, the plea avoided a lengthy trial but offered little solace. Her mother called the act pure evil, and relatives vowed that Isaiah would grow up knowing the truth about his mother's love. The case left investigators grappling with an unsettling question. How far will someone go to maintain a lie? For Kathy Coy, the answer was unthinkable, and for Jamie Steese's family, the impact will last a lifetime. 5. Adele Craven. Adele Vicuna Craven was 39 years old when her husband's murder shattered the quiet suburb of Edgewood, Kentucky. Born in California and trained as a mortician, she met Stephen Craven, a Coast Guard pilot, and quickly fell into a whirlwind romance. The couple married in 1989 and built what appeared to be an ideal life: 2 young sons, a beautiful home, and Stephen's successful career with Delta Airlines. But behind closed doors, cracks were forming. Friends later described a marriage marked by constant arguments, Adele's unhappiness, and whispers of her longing for something more. By the spring of 2000, Adele's personal life had shifted in a dangerous direction. While remodeling their basement, she grew close to Rusty McIntyre, the son of their contractor. Their professional relationship soon turned intimate, and Adele confided in him about her dissatisfaction with Stephen. Prosecutors would later argue that Adele began plotting her husband's death driven by resentment, the promise of a $500,000 life insurance policy, and the allure of starting fresh with her new lover. On July 12, 2000, that plan unfolded. Stephen had stayed home from work. Preparing for an upcoming vacation, Adele seized the opportunity. While their children were away, she coordinated with McIntyre and another man, Ron Pryor, to ambush Stephen in the basement. Investigators say Adele lured him there under a simple pretense, knowing what awaited him. What followed was staged to look like a break-in, but detectives quickly saw through the ruse. The crime scene, the inconsistencies in Adele's statements, and her unusually calm demeanor raised immediate suspicions. The investigation moved swiftly. Phone records revealed hundreds of calls between Adele and McIntyre in the weeks before the murder, including dozens on the day Stephen died. When confronted, McIntyre confessed, implicating Adele as the mastermind. Pryor, too, admitted his role, describing how she directed the attack and even insisted he finish the job when Stephen showed signs of life. Their testimonies, combined with physical evidence recovered from a landfill, painted a damning picture of premeditation. Adele's first trial ended in a hung jury, but prosecutors were undeterred. At her second trial in 2004, faced with overwhelming evidence and the threat of a possible death sentence, she changed her plea to guilty. In exchange, she received life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Stephen's family, while relieved to avoid years of appeals, expressed mixed emotions, grateful for closure, but haunted by the betrayal at the crime's core. Psychologists have speculated that Adele's actions stemmed from deep resentment and a desire to escape a life she no longer wanted. Whether for money, passion, or freedom, her choices left 2 children without parents and a community stunned by the deception. In the courtroom, Stephen's mother described her grief plainly. She killed him many times, first in planning, then in doing. The question that lingers: how does love turn into something so lethal? 6. Tonya Ford. Tonya Ford was 25 when she met David Ford, a dedicated police officer in Lebanon, Kentucky. He was older, a man of structure and discipline, while Tonya was known for her warmth and close ties to family. Friends and neighbors saw them as a blended household, David bringing children from a previous relationship, and Tonya adding her own care and support to the family. Outwardly, they seemed like an ordinary couple, managing the demands of work, raising kids, and making a home together. But behind closed doors, their relationship was far more complicated. By 2009, the marriage had grown strained. Those closest to David described constant tension, fueled by arguments and talk of divorce, He confided to friends that he felt watched, even threatened, after receiving anonymous notes that unnerved him. Investigators later believed those notes were written by Tonya herself, an early sign of the turmoil brewing in their home. For Tonya, who faced the possibility of a failing marriage, financial pressures, and deep resentment toward her husband, the conflict appeared to reach a breaking point. On February 10th, 2009, Tonya called 911 in distress. She reported finding David lying on the floor of their Campbellsville home, unresponsive. To the dispatcher, it sounded like the panic of a wife stumbling upon a tragedy. But to detectives arriving at the scene, subtle details felt off. Tonya had identified that David had been shot without approaching his body. There were no signs of forced entry, and her emotional reactions, recorded on the 911 call and later during questioning, struck investigators as inconsistent. The case initially stalled. There were no eyewitnesses, and much of the evidence was circumstantial. But over the next year, Kentucky State Police meticulously pieced together a timeline. Cell phone records placed Tonya near the home during the crucial minutes surrounding David's death. Contradicting her claim that she had been elsewhere, a fingerprint linked her to one of the threatening notes David had received. And perhaps most damaging, witnesses testified that Tonya had once said she could kill David if she thought she could get away with it. 18 months after the shooting, a grand jury indicted Tonya Ford for murder. Her trial drew national attention, even becoming the subject of the true crime series Snapped. Prosecutors argued that she killed David during an escalating domestic dispute. While the defense claimed the evidence was circumstantial and misinterpreted, after days of deliberation, the jury found her guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 17. Psychologists have speculated that Tonya's motives were rooted in resentment and fear of losing control over her life. Whether born of anger, desperation, or both, her actions left 4 children without their father and, in many ways, without their mother too. During sentencing, David's family offered a simple, painful truth. We've waited years for justice. Nothing can bring him back. 7. Lafonda Fay Foster. Lafonda Fay Foster was just 22 when she became the central figure in one of Kentucky's most shocking mass murders. Raised in a deeply troubled environment, her childhood was marred by abuse and instability. By her late teens, she had fallen into drug addiction and petty crime, a trajectory that only worsened when she met Tina Powell, a woman 5 years her senior. Their bond was intense, complicated by substance abuse and a volatile relationship that would spiral into violence. By 1986, both women were living on the margins of Lexington, Kentucky, estranged from stable family ties, surviving on drugs, alcohol, and occasional theft. Those who knew them described a destructive cycle: long nights of drinking, frequent fights, and impulsive decisions. It was during one of these binges, on April 23rd of that year, that a day of drinking and petty disputes erupted into a killing spree. Their victims were not strangers. Each had some personal or social connection to the pair, from acquaintances at neighborhood gatherings to friends of friends caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Over several hours, the women abducted and murdered 5 individuals: Carlos and Virginia Kearns, Trudy Harrell, Jimmy Roger Keene, and Theodore Sweet. The crimes unfolded across multiple locations in Lexington, a chaotic series of events involving stolen cars, desperate attempts to obtain drugs, and escalating acts of violence. Though the killings were brutal, the pattern suggested more than simple robbery. Investigators later described them as acts driven by rage, impulsivity, and a shared descent into madness, fueled by intoxication. When the murders were discovered, the scale of the violence stunned local authorities. Multiple crime scenes within a 5-mile radius revealed victims shot, stabbed, and left abandoned. The final, chilling detail came when a burned vehicle containing some of the bodies was located, a discovery that cemented the case as Lexington's worst mass murder at the time. Foster and Powell were arrested within hours of the final killing. After arriving at a hospital to clean themselves and call for a taxi, their behavior raised suspicion, and soon both were taken into custody. As the investigation unfolded, evidence including witness statements, physical evidence, and Foster's own incriminating remarks to fellow inmates built an overwhelming case. At trial, both women were convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder. Powell received life imprisonment, while Foster was sentenced to death, only the second woman in Kentucky history to face that penalty. Years later, her death sentence was overturned, replaced with life without parole. Psychologists who studied Foster described her as emotionally disturbed, shaped by early trauma and long-term drug dependence. Yet even amid explanations, the question of motive lingered. Were these killings about money, rage, or the chaos of 2 lives in freefall? To this day, the murders of April 1986 remain a haunting reminder of how personal demons can ignite into unthinkable tragedy. 8. Brenda Humphrey. Brenda Humphrey was 34 years old when she became entangled in a crime that would horrify Kentucky and devastate a young woman's family. Born in 1954, Humphrey's early life remains largely unrecorded, but by adulthood, she had fallen into a turbulent cycle of prostitution, drug use, and petty crime. Those close to her described a woman shaped by hardship and addiction, someone who lived on the edges of society and relied on fleeting relationships to survive. When she met Gregory Wilson, a man with an equally troubled past, the relationship that followed would become dangerously destructive. By the spring of 1987, Humphrey and Wilson were desperate homeless, jobless, and struggling to sustain their addictions. The two spent their days moving between cheap motels and city streets, seeking quick ways to make money. That desperation would become the backdrop for a crime of opportunity, one that escalated far beyond what Humphrey later claimed she expected. On the night of May 29th, 1987, 36-year-old Deborah Pooley had just finished her shift at a local restaurant in Covington, Kentucky. She was walking to her car, likely exhausted but thinking of home, when Humphrey and Wilson approached her. According to court testimony, Humphrey drove Pooley's vehicle while Wilson forced the woman into the back seat. Their stated intention was robbery, but the events that followed spiraled into something far darker. Over the course of several hours, Pooley was held captive as the pair traveled to cross state lines into Indiana. Along the way, she pleaded for her life, words that Humphrey herself would later recount in court. Pooley never returned home. Her body was eventually discovered in a wooded area in Indiana, identified only through dental records. The details that emerged painted a chilling picture. The crime involved abduction, sexual assault, and eventual murder. Credit cards stolen from Pooley were used shortly afterward for shopping sprees, evidence that would later link Humphrey and Wilson directly to the killing. The investigation moved quickly. Tips from acquaintances led police to the couple, who were arrested just weeks later. Their trial in 1988 gripped the community not only because of the brutality of the crime, but because it involved a woman as an active participant. Wilson received the death penalty. Humphrey, spared execution, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. In later parole hearings, Humphrey expressed remorse, calling herself a coward and admitting that her silence and complicity cost an innocent woman her life. Psychologists noted her deep entanglement with Wilson and long history of substance abuse, factors that blurred the lines between fear, dependence, and choice. Even decades later, The name Deborah Pooley still evokes sorrow among friends and family. And for Brenda Humphrey, the question lingers. Was she a willing partner in a violent crime, or a broken woman who lacked the courage to stop it? 9. Christina Tompkins Marcum. Christina Tompkins. Marcum was 30 years old when she stood trial for a murder that shocked Madison County, Kentucky. Born in 1983, Marcum's life was defined by turbulent relationships and a history of personal struggles. Those who knew her described a young woman who could be charismatic one moment and volatile the next, a pattern that became more pronounced during her years with Jason Singleton, a man whose own troubled past mirrored her own. Their relationship was intense, marked by breakups, reconciliations, and accusations of abuse, a cycle that would ultimately spiral into tragedy. The tension began when Jason ended his engagement to Marcum and quickly married another woman, Angela Fraser Singleton. For Christina, the rejection was devastating. Friends and witnesses would later recall her anger and obsession with Jason, and her resentment toward Angela, who now lived in the house Christina once shared with him. Law enforcement records paint a picture of escalating hostility, harassing phone calls, confrontations at odd hours, even reported acts of vandalism. This toxic dynamic created a dangerous emotional pressure cooker. In January 2011, that pressure erupted. On the morning of January 16th. Angela Singleton vanished. Days later, her dismembered remains were discovered in rural Madison County, concealed in multiple garbage bags. The discovery horrified the community, but the details that emerged during the investigation were even more disturbing. Angela's husband, Jason Singleton, was arrested shortly afterward and, in a plea agreement, admitted complicity in her murder. He alleged that Christina Marcum had been the one to carry out the act, a claim Marcum consistently denied. The evidence, however, suggested deep entanglement. Investigators uncovered text messages exchanged between Christina and Jason during the critical hours of Angela's disappearance. Witnesses described Christina's behavior in the days leading up to the crime: confrontations with Angela, stalking incidents, and threats. In interviews with police, Marcum gave shifting statements, at times claiming she tried to stop Jason, and at others asserting she had no part in the murder at all. Her defense argued that she was a victim herself, manipulated and intimidated by a man she feared a claim supported, in part by a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. Prosecutors, however, painted her as an active participant driven by jealousy and rage. After a highly publicized trial in 2014, Marcum was convicted of complicity to murder. Along with charges of tampering with evidence and hindering prosecution, she received a 30-year prison sentence. Jason Singleton, already serving time for related crimes, was also sentenced to 30 years for his role. Psychological assessments later suggested that Marcum's motives stemmed from a combination of obsessive attachment and intense resentment emotions, amplified by substance abuse and volatile personality traits. Whether she directly ended Angela's life or simply stood by, the court found her culpable. As Marcum began serving her sentence, one question lingered for many. Was she a victim of circumstance, or the architect of her own destruction? 10. Cheryl McCafferty. Cheryl McCafferty was 43 years old when her life and the lives of everyone around her changed forever. Born in 1964, she grew up in Kentucky and later built what many believed was an enviable life. She was married to Robert McCafferty, a successful sales executive, and together they raised 2 children in Fort Thomas, a quiet suburban community. To neighbors, the McCaffertys appeared to have it all: a beautiful home, financial security, and a family that seemed picture perfect. But behind closed doors, Cheryl claimed The reality was far darker. Cheryl's marriage, according to her testimony, was marred by years of emotional and physical abuse. Friends and family members later spoke about the dual nature of Robert's personality, charming and outgoing in public, yet controlling and volatile in private. Cheryl's own sister described a long pattern of violence she alleged had been hidden for years. Whether these claims were entirely accurate or not became one of the central questions in the case. By June 2007, the McCaffertys' marriage had deteriorated beyond repair. Mounting financial stress and conflicts over their teenage children's future only intensified tensions. Cheryl would later testify that she lived in fear of Robert's unpredictable rages and believed her life and the lives of her children were in danger. On the night of June 25th, that fear reached a breaking point. Cheryl called 911 just after dawn, calmly stating she had shot her husband. When police arrived, Robert was found dead in the couple's bedroom. Investigators were immediately skeptical of Cheryl's claim of self-defense. The physical evidence suggested Robert had been asleep when he was shot, a fact prosecutors used to argue that Cheryl's actions were not defensive, but deliberate. They pointed to her financial troubles and hinted at deeper motives, including an alleged obsession with her daughter's modeling career. Cheryl's defense countered with years of alleged abuse and argued that the shooting followed a night of terror, not premeditation. The trial in 2009 gripped northern Kentucky. Media coverage was intense, with national outlets descending on the small community. Jurors heard conflicting testimony. Forensic evidence that questioned Cheryl's account and emotional testimony describing years of domestic turmoil. In the end, they rejected a murder conviction, but found her guilty of first-degree manslaughter. Cheryl accepted an 18-year sentence, a deal that allowed her to seek parole far sooner than expected. Psychological evaluations suggested Cheryl's mindset was shaped by long-term emotional trauma, though prosecutors argued she was calculating rather than fearful. The case remains polarizing. Was Cheryl McCafferty a battered woman pushed beyond endurance, or a wife who saw no other way out? As Cheryl began serving her sentence, one haunting question lingered. In a marriage built on appearances, where does the truth really lie, and who gets to define it? 11. Lillie Stanton. Lillie Stanton was 48 years old when she committed a crime that would devastate not only her own family, but an entire community. Living in Winchester, Kentucky, Stanton shared her modest home with her adult daughter, Adele Craven Stanton, and Danielle's 22-month-old daughter, Cadence. To neighbors, they seemed close, a three-generation household where the grandmother often doted on the little girl, pushing her stroller around the neighborhood. But beneath this ordinary facade, tension was growing, centered on a bitter custody dispute involving Cadence's father. In May of 2012, the family faced a looming court hearing that could expand the father's visitation rights. For reasons still debated, this development triggered a catastrophic response in Lillie Stanton. According to her own confession, she feared what the increased access might mean and convinced herself that ending both her daughter's and granddaughter's lives was the only way to protect them. It was a decision born of fear and perhaps desperation, but one that would shock even seasoned investigators. On May 20th, inside the home they all shared on Vaught Road, Stanton carried out her plan. Police records later revealed that she first approached her sleeping granddaughter, lifted her from bed, and took her downstairs. Moments later, she turned on her daughter, Danielle. When the act was over, Stanton attempted to take her own life, inflicting wounds that ultimately failed to be fatal. Hours later, her ex-husband returned home to a scene that defied comprehension and immediately called police. Officers arriving on the scene found Stanton conscious but gravely injured. At the hospital, she confessed to the killings. Citing her fears about the custody dispute as her primary motive, detectives described her demeanor as detached, almost resigned, as she recounted what had happened. The confession removed any doubt about her responsibility, but it did little to answer the deeper question. Why? The ensuing investigation uncovered no prior reports of violence in the home. Friends and neighbors were stunned, describing Lillie as a devoted grandmother. The prosecution, however, focused on her calculated actions and the fact that the victims were defenseless. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of the death penalty, Stanton pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder in early 2014. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Psychologists who reviewed the case suggested that Stanton's actions may have stemmed from extreme emotional distress and a profound fear of losing control over her family. Others viewed her decision as one of desperation rather than malice, a tragic misjudgment with irreversible consequences. At her sentencing, Stanton spoke only a few words. "I killed my daughter and granddaughter." That stark admission echoed in the silent courtroom, leaving behind a haunting question that lingers even now: what drives a mother and grandmother to destroy the very lives she once protected? 12. Billi Jo Smallwood. Billi Jo Smallwood was 39 years old when she was convicted of a crime that stunned the tight-knit military community of Fort Campbell, Kentucky. A mother of 3, she had built her life around the rhythms of Army life: frequent relocations, the challenges of deployment, and the pressures of raising children largely on her own. Friends and neighbors described her as a caring mother who was active in her church and deeply protective of her children. But prosecutors would later argue that behind that image was a woman trapped in a volatile marriage and desperate for a way out. Smallwood's relationship with her husband, Army Specialist Wayne Smallwood, was complicated and, at times, stormy. Allegations of financial strain and marital conflict surfaced during the investigation. At the center of it all was a $400,000 life insurance policy in Wayne's name. Prosecutors claimed that Billi Jo saw that policy as her escape from a failing marriage, a way to secure financial freedom for herself and her children. On March 29, 2007, just after returning from a family trip, a fire tore through their 2-story home on the Fort Campbell Army post. Inside were Billi Jo, her husband, and their 3 children. 2 of the children, 9-year-old Sam Fagan and 2-year-old Rebecca Smallwood, did not survive. Wayne managed to escape by leaping from an upstairs window, injuring his leg. Their youngest daughter, Neve, was carried to safety. Billi Jo herself suffered burns but survived. From the beginning, the fire's origin raised suspicion. Investigators determined it had been deliberately set, fueled by gasoline poured in the dining area. A gas can, purchased just 12 hours before the blaze, was found among the debris. Smoke detectors had been removed, and the home's doors were locked from the inside. Initially, Billi Jo claimed an intruder had started the fire, even citing a threatening phone call the night before, but phone records revealed no such call had ever been made. The case moved slowly through the courts, delayed by evidentiary challenges and appeals. During the 2012 trial, prosecutors argued that Smallwood had intended to kill her husband for the insurance payout, but instead caused the deaths of her children. The defense countered that she was a loving mother, incapable of harming her own children, and pointed to the chaotic state of her marriage as evidence of emotional turmoil rather than premeditation. After only 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Smallwood was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison and ordered to pay over $200,000 in restitution for the damage caused by the fire. She continues to maintain her innocence, even as the court's decision remains final. In the end, 2 young lives were lost, and a family was shattered. The lingering question whether desperation or something darker drove Billi Jo Smallwood remains a haunting mystery for those who knew her best.